Hi guys, in this video I want to go through the Consumer Price Index. There's a few tables here we're going to look at. The first one, Table 1, is the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. It's identified as CPI-U, and it's giving us the U.S. city average by expenditure category, and this particular report is for January 2019. The base period is 82 to 84. We know from all indices that base periods equal 100. So this gives us the expenditure category, and then it also gives us the relative importance, which is the weight that those particular items made up in the Consumer Price Index basket. And that's important because, for example, all items are 100%. But notice food makes up 13%. Okay, and then it breaks down food into its respective categories. Down here you have all items without food and energy, which is 79%. Okay. By the way, whenever we take the all items category and we back out all food and energy, that result is known as the core CPI. Okay. Food and energy tend to be volatile components of spending. So by removing them, you get a less volatile consumer price index. Okay, so once we understand the relative importance, now let's look at the indexes. So for all items in January 2018, the index was at 247.867. Okay. By January 2019, it went up to 251.712. From these two numbers, we can calculate an inflation rate. Remember, the consumer price index basket, right? All these items in here, they stay fixed over time. So any change in the index must reflect price changes. Another way to think about it is what the government is doing is they're going out in January 2018 and they're buying this basket with all these things in it. And they're looking at how much they spend on that basket. And then they do the same thing in January 2019. They buy the same basket. Okay? They look at how much they spend. Since the index we get here is higher than the index here, it means they spent more in January 2019 on the same basket they bought in January 2018. So again, the difference must be price increases. We can calculate those price increases by using that formula that we've actually used multiple times, but I'll remind you, it's the later period divided by the earlier period. So I'll put it right here. Later period divided by the earlier period minus 1. Okay? And then you can multiply that by 100 if you want to get a percentage. Okay. Let's do that. If I go into my calculator here and I put in some numbers, let me go ahead and put in 251.712. Okay, and I'm going to divide that because that's the later period, right? I'm going to divide that by 247.867. Press enter, and then I'm going to go ahead and subtract 1, and it's in decimal form, but I will convert that to a percentage, and I get 1.55, which as you can see is rounded to 1.6. So that's the way we would calculate the inflation rate. And that means that this basket, right, with all these goods in it, 1.6% more expensive in January 2019 compared to January 2018. Okay. Now, of course, you should know how to do the calculation, but you can see over here the results. And usually the overall CPI doesn't increase that much in the US. It has in the past. The last time we had a lot of inflation was in the 70s, but usually we're anywhere between 1 and 3% on average when we look at annual changes. Okay. Notice it's similar for food, right? This is all items, but if we look at food, it's 1.6. And then you can see that as far as food goes, dairy products went down. Continue down here. Looks like this one went up quite a bit. This is non-alcoholic beverages and beverage materials up 2.2%. Food away from home up 2.8%. So a little bit on the higher end there. Then you get into energy. Energy is very volatile, and you'll see some pretty big numbers here. So down 4.8%. So this is actually deflation in the energy sector. Down 9.7% in energy commodities, most notably motor fuel. Gasoline down 10%. Okay, so you can see how the components do matter. When you take this all items category, we see 1.6% inflation. That's what would hit the headlines. But if you back out food and energy, okay, so you take out all of the volatile components, you actually get 2.2%. And that should make sense because remember, we started with 1.6% inflation. And what did we take out? We took out a lot of deflation here, which means that you're getting a higher inflation rate when you remove the decreased prices from energy. Okay. Doesn't always work like that, right? Sometimes the core CPI might actually be less than the all items because maybe these energy components or food components are going up dramatically. Maybe there's a lot of inflation, so when you remove them, you actually get a lower core CPI. The core CPI is the one that the government likes to focus on because they see, especially if we're looking at short periods of time, like month over month, they see these components as too volatile to really give us much insight into trends in inflation. All right, so there's also other goods down here. So you've got apparel, right? You've got used cars and trucks, but nothing really dramatic here. It looks like rental of a primary residence was up 3.4% over this period. So rents went up. This is an interesting component here, shelter, because shelter is clearly housing, but for the consumer price index, it's measured by rents paid. They don't look at, for example, if you have a mortgage on a home that you're buying, they don't look at the mortgage payment. They don't look at the property taxes. I mean, those are real costs for shelter for people that own a home, but it's not considered in the consumer price index. Instead, they just look at rents. And if you are renting from a landlord, then clearly that's rent of a primary residence. But if you own the home, then they imagine what that home would rent for. And they say, well, that's kind of what the owner is giving up in terms of rent. All right, and then you got physician services in here. Looks like medical services went up 2.4%. Looks like airline fares went down 2.8%. Okay, so that's the first page. Notice over here, it does give you seasonally adjusted changes as well. Okay. And normally we would want to use the seasonally adjusted percent change, especially if we're looking over the course of a year. If you're looking month to month, seasonally adjusted doesn't really matter. The seasons occur over a 1-year time frame. If we go to table A, this one is kind of a more abbreviated form for the consumer price index, all items. And it looks at it for each month, and it's doing the seasonally adjusted changes from the preceding month, and then it gives us an unadjusted 12-month ending. So for example, for all items from December 2018 to January 2019, we had zero inflation. What I should say is for the month of January 2019, we had zero inflation. For the month of December 2018, we had zero inflation. Because when it says January, that's effectively starting January 1st and ending at the end of January. And then you've got the unadjusted 12 months ending. It's unadjusted, it's yearly, so we don't need to do a seasonally adjusted 1.6%. And that is what you saw in the previous table. So this is just giving you more of the percent changes than the other table was giving you. Okay, now let's switch to the third table. And this one is table 4, third one we're looking at. And this shows the consumer price index for select areas. So this breaks it down. U.S. overall was 1.6% in January 2018. But notice by region, it varies. So you've got 4 regions here in general, and the big one was the West, 2.7% overall. And this is important because, you know, the U.S. is a diverse market. So what people feel in terms of inflation in one area may not be resonating in another area. You know, if you're living in the Midwest in January 2018, you've only witnessed 0.8% inflation. But if you're living in the West, you see 2.7%. Now, quite frankly, people wouldn't notice these differences to any large extent. But the gaps may get even bigger as an inflationary cycle takes hold. So if we were back in the 70s style inflation, you know, you could see 12% in the West and maybe 6% in the Midwest, that kind of gap. And that's where people actually sometimes relocate based on cost of living. No surprise there, a lot of you have witnessed home prices go up as one specific part of the CPI. So while home prices have went up dramatically more in San Diego than they have in, you know, parts of Oklahoma. So some people move from San Diego to Oklahoma or to Texas or to Nevada, Arizona because they want to escape the higher cost of living. All right, and then down here it talks about select local areas. And you'll notice that we've got a lot of major metropolitan areas here. And it's important to note that the CPI, it is a urban consumer index, which means it's not tracking the cost of living in non-urban areas. So that is kind of illustrated here when you look at the major cities they're analyzing. But overall, you can see Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim, that metropolitan area had 3.2% inflation. And then down here in Riverside, San Bernardino, Ontario, 3%. And then San Diego, Carlsbad, 2.6%. And then you look at some of the lower ones, and, you know, we don't have information for these, but you'll notice down here, it looks like 0.4. So Denver, Aurora, Lakewood, Colorado, 0.4%. Okay, and again, that is for January 2018 from the prior year. Okay, lastly, let's shift back to the first page. And that was the table 1. Remember, these increases in the index, which are reflected in the inflation rate, represent more costly products. So we can think in terms of how much money people make in one period and how much more they would need to make in order to maintain their standard of living. So for example, let's say that you make $30,000 a year. Okay, make $30,000. Well, if you make $30,000 a year in January 2018, okay, that's going to get you a certain amount of goods. That's going to be a lot more than if you spend $30,000 in January 2019, right? Because everything's higher. How do we determine how much more costly it is to buy the same basket? Well, you take the $30,000 that you're spending, or whatever it is, and you increase it by the percentage. So the way to do this is to just multiply the 30,000 by 1 plus the percentage rate. So 1.016, right? Because 0.016 is 1.6%. And if you do that correctly, it says you need 30,480, which means you need $480 a year to buy the same basket in January 2019 as you needed in January 2018. Okay? So if you didn't get a raise, then you're getting less stuff with that 30,000 here than you did here. Okay, that's it. If you have questions, let me know. Thanks.